So thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. We are very pleased to present the book of Professor Paul Collier for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a lava. One is not enough. I have to restart. So thank you very much for being here today for the presentation of the book of Professor Paul Collier. We are very happy to have him here for a number of reasons. Obviously, first of all, for who he is, for the influence of his thought, his work at Oxford, his work at the World Bank, his work as a worldwide author, if you want. Secondly, if I may, for the global vision that he brings to these rooms, in the sense that the book is full of reference and his work is full of reference to very different experiences. Third, for the topic of the book. The book is a book on left behind places. The title in Italian is Poveri abbandonati. It's interesting to mention that, if I understand correctly, the book has been published in different languages at the same time in order to emphasize really the idea of a global book that arrives in different countries, in different cultures, in different political experiences at the same time. Left Behind Places is really one of the words of today's geography, of today's economy, of today's politics. It's interesting to see that in the last 10 years, it has been a word that has been recurrent in the documentation of the European Commission. It's interesting to note that in the letters of mission of President von der Leyen to some of his commissioners, the concept comes back. So the book of Professor Paul Collier arrives at the right moment in the sense that it brings a global discussion and it tries to give some paths of activity. Just one word on where you are, Professor. You are in Svimec. Svimec is since the first after World War, Second World War, a center of thought specialized in Italian in Italy's Mezzogiorno, and so I would say it's the right place to talk about these issues. Let me say that I'm especially happy to have organized this with Istituto per la Democrazia Alfredo Reiklin, simply because I think that both the global vision and the idea that from global problems you have to arrive at very concrete solutions is been possibly the line of thought of Alfredo Reiklin, who, in my view, has been one of the most globally open intellectuals and politicians in Italy's after Second World War period. There is a plane. There is a plane to be taken in about an hour and 10 minutes. So we will be organized this presentation, first of all, giving the floor to President Adriano Giannola. Then we'll have a discussion on the book. Francesco Drago from University of Catania, specialized in political economy, and the person who made the preface to your book, will be opening the discussion. Then it will be the turn of Giulia Turà, who currently teaches at Lewis with a specialization in immigration and poverty issues. And finally, it will close the discussion Andrea Brandolini from the Bank of Italy, who is Deputy Director General of the department dealing with economic statistics and research. And finally, President Giuliano Amato. And then it will be speaking, and finally, President Amato will be closing, or whatever. President Amato decides always what to do. So maybe before Professor Collier. Perfect. Okay. So after the three, it will be the turn of President Amato, and then Professor Collier will close. Adriano, Presidente.
Professor Collier, and very, very, in a short time, just to say that I had books of as me met that from one side in Chicago is the initiative, the difficulties, etc. Especially at the end of the book, very successful. And Collier, how would you interpret what you just divided Italian, the dualistic state, pretends to be very advanced, and now it's more in crowd. And that is and very difficult, very in trouble to try to find to develop. It's point of view that looks 46. The idea was to the Italian question. The Italian question was exactly the dualism, and we have an enormous literature on that topic, the so-called meridionalismo classico, that is very rich, Nitti and before Fortunato, etc. But the problem was to find a modern with a very, very clear program that, you could criticize it. And that program, because of this, for the first time in the unity involved in the program, bring Italy to the economic miracle that up to the end of the 60s, it brought the southern Italian gross product to be more or less 70%, the per capita income 65% of the Italian averages, starting from less than 51, 52%. Now, of so-called place policy, the decentralized policy, that figure is of per capita income is back to the 50s. It was a complete failure in our view, and not because North or South, because a lack of direction, a lack of strategy. As now, with the PNRR, we have no strategy. And so the risk is to find at the end in 2020, not to have solved some not to have performance that the southern part of the country. That is a question how to deal with a country that at the same time problems in the national economy. But, it's a very addressing. I'm interested in your opinion, because I'm sure you know quite well the problem.
Okay, so as you said, I wrote the introduction, the preface for this book, and I have to say that it's an extraordinary sources of stories of places left behind. You can see from the book the civic passion that the author put on it, and at the same time maintaining the rigorous analysis. So congratulations, first of all, on this very interesting book. What is I will try to give you an overview, a brief overview of the book. What is the fil rouge of all these places? Following technological, political, demographic, or natural shocks, these places become places that are left behind. Pro-market policies, mainstream economics, the so-called Chicago School influence, are unable to react to these shocks. And actually, most of the times, these policies are the condition, create the condition for these shocks. So the main point of these places is that top-down policies very often place-bind policies remove agency from the local communities, and these local communities are unable basically to react to these shocks, and these places become most of the times permanently left behind. So local communities without agency cannot self-determine their destiny, basically. And this leads, of course, to frustration, resentment, and economic deprivation. So the agency, according to the author, should rest with local people who are better placed to judge what works in their context. They know much better than the central authority what works and what does not work. So some policy prescriptions, bottom-up processes, promoting agency for local communities, devolution of powers to local communities. Devolution is not a panacea, cannot work for any place, but sure, according to if I interpreted well, centralization cannot work. So I would like to articulate the discussion around 3 points if I have the time, but tell me if I have stopped. First, where we are now with the consensus in the economic and policy arena about left behind places. Second, some critical issues about the author's prescriptions, in particular with respect to the compatible institutional configuration under which this devolution can take place. And second, if I have time, a reference to the Italian argument. You were saying something? No. Sorry, and then thank you. Good. Third. Okay, as for the first, okay, where we are now, place-based policies, politiche territoriali, were a forbidden word until 10 years ago, actually. The rationale for spending federal dollars to try to encourage less advantaged people to stay in economically weak places is extremely weak. This is from Edward Glaser, who is one of the father of urban economics professor at Harvard. Today, a policy that pushes the objective of accelerating the development of the south of Italy must not overlap with general policies. It must first of all be the conscious, wise declination of the latter on the territory. This was our former governor of the Bank of Italy, Mario Draghi, in 2009. Now it's clear that after Brexit, after Trump, after in Italy, Movimento 5 Stelle, and all the resentment, the consensus rapidly changed, and the same people arguing against place-based policies now are in favor of it. They are doing research on it, and so fortunately the consensus changed. I would say that now somehow the mainstream is toward place-based policies. And this is a good news perhaps for us. Together with the consensus, the share of countries adopting forms of asymmetric decentralization, federalism, autonomia differenziata in Italy, at the region, and especially at the urban areas, doubled in the world in the last years, in the last decades. And this trend seems in line with the author's argument. We should give power and agency to local communities. But, I would say but, of course, for a matter of incentives, local power comes with, for instance, fiscal federalism. And here comes the potential contradiction in this argument. First of all, not all the places, of course, can be prosperous. We know that agglomeration economies are important, have been always important, especially important today. Human and physical capital tend to concentrate in a few places, and in this process there are losers, of course, that are the cities that lose citizens and resources, and there are winners that are the big cities. So how we should deal with communities that are left behind, for instance, in rural areas, in the area interne? I mean, we cannot say that all the places can be prosperous, all the places can be technological advance, and so on and so forth. They should clearly, in my opinion, be subsidized. The center from the rich areas. But here is the second question, under which sustainable institutional arrangement, if we give local power to communities, they should be able also to use their own funds. And this, of course, I mean, creates a tension between redistribution from rich to poor areas. Rich areas are rich areas willing to give money and subsidies to communities that are free to use and self-determine their own funds. This is actually a debate that is very relevant today in Italy. Is it credible that in these communities, all the communities, even small communities, we were talking about this briefly with President Amato, agency and bottom-up processes are the driver of conscious and wise policy decision, can be the source of prosperity and growth. So we know that in these left behind places, most of the time, let me say, the best people with a high human capital, with a high propensity to risk, leave these places, and giving local power to these communities. Actually, one could argue, a person like me that lives in the south, that sometimes this could create problems. Actually, institutional capture by local elites that are unable and actually exploit this local power. So this is to say, I mean, all these policy prescriptions are super interesting, but at the same time, we should think about these potential, I mean, I would say potential contradictions that can rise. And this comes to the last point. Among scholars of territorial divides, there was always a debate between people that arguing that we should give more power to the central authority, and people or scholars that argue that we should give more power to local authorities. This is something that I discuss very often with my colleague and friend Lucrezia. And we think that it's a discussion that is not very useful if we don't address the institutional configuration that is compatible with this kind of balance between local and centralized power. Because at the end of the day, good institutions, they are neither built from above nor by giving just voice to the local territories. Of course, the virtuous processes are the result of local experiences, but these local experiences must be reinterpreted for a national project that is coherent and consistent with a national project. And I would say national project because I mean, redistribution is key. And so in this context, and therefore the nation should be willing to subsidize, for instance, local communities. So without this cross-tracks between local and central authorities, it's difficult to have effective policies, in my opinion, even for places left behind. Of course, giving voice to the best that the society expresses in every abandoned place is key, and I totally agree with the author. And it is imperative to bring these places back on the path of rebirth. Okay. Am I fine?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, Julia.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this book. I think this book is tackling a challenging topic, as the title says, about neglected places, and discuss huge economic differences that we observe across countries. So with some countries more developed than others, but importantly, it also talks about profound differences within a country across regions, locations, yes, and groups. And there is a chapter that I like very much, which is talking about the inclusion and importance of the inclusion. So if we think about these differences across regions that are facing the same institution, the natural question is why? And one fundamental concept is inclusion, with the saying that inclusion is able to foster equality of opportunities and development overall. And there are many examples of inclusions and inclusive societies in the book. So this makes me think about how we can translate this notion of inclusion in the today context, where today contemporary society are increasingly more diverse, especially along ethnic lines. So economic and social differences are culturally charged. And so, for example, the recent surge in refugees and forced immigration globally unveil new social, economic, and political concerns. The public opinion is divided, and there is a vivid debate on intergroup prejudice and stereotypes. So where stereotypes are mental representation of differences between groups that allows for faster processing of information. These misperceptions or wrong representation induce distortion in social behavior and potentially are consequential. So when we look at differences in this respect, we see that there is unequal access to economic, social, and political opportunities. There are consequences in terms of support for restrictive policies, exclusion and isolation of some groups compared to others, and potentially to the very extreme case, what we observe is intergroup conflict. So in the rest of the talk, I could like to show some facts about misperception, especially regarding immigration, consequences in terms of support for anti-immigration parties or restrictive policies, and how potential inclusion may help close a little bit this gap. So to provide evidence about misperception, I refer to this paper by Alesina and co-authors. And this author conducted a large-scale survey on 6 different developed countries, from US to UK, Sweden, and Italy, And what they show is that there are huge misperceptions, both about the number of immigrants, but also about their characteristics. So in all countries, respondents greatly overestimate the total number of immigrants. So the perception about the share of immigrants, so the red dot on the right panel, are always way higher compared to the actual number, so compared to the blue dot. So for example, for US, you see that the actual number of immigrants is around 10% in the population, while the prediction of respondents is around 35%, so 3 times as large. And what is even more interesting to me is that natives have huge misperception about the characteristics of immigrants. So they generally think that immigrants are culturally and religiously more distant compared to what they actually are. And they face them as economically weaker, so less educated, with higher unemployment and more reliant on welfare transfer compared to what they actually are. So these misperceptions, of course, then translate into behavioral consequences and affect redistribution. So the willingness of individual to accept the redistribution from rich to poor or from richer area to poorer area. Misperception translates also into anti-immigration sentiments. So here I refer to a paper of Ann Gardner and other co-authors that looks at the last refugee crisis in 2015, which has been, faced a huge debate. So in 2015, when Greek island closer to the Turkish coast experienced a sudden and massive increase in refugees arrival, other islands, which are slightly farther away, did not experience this massive shock. And the author in this paper elicited natives' attitudes and perception towards refugees via a survey. And what they show is that exposure to refugees' arrival induce sizable and lasting natives' hostility. So the black estimates on the top row show that respondents living in exposed islands experience an increase in their hostility towards refugees. And then looking at outcomes as a compound effect, so as an average effect. But then looking at outcomes separately, what we observe is that there are consistent changes in policy preferences. So the blue estimates show that respondents are more likely to support banning refugee kids from school, support more restrictive policy limiting the number of new inflows arriving, and change attitudes and beliefs. So the green line shows that exposed respondents believe that asylum seekers are much more likely to commit crime, to commit terrorist attack, and they represent a burden for Greece. So all these negative attitudes and beliefs in the second panel resonate and reverberate on the immigrants population and on other Muslim minorities in the community, even if they were already present in the population. Yes, thanks. Another one. So, and then translating these attitudes and belief into political outcomes, I would like to show another one, please. Thanks. Okay, we can't see, so just trust me. So in this paper, the authors document that exposure to refugees migration affect electoral success, so voting for anti-immigration parties. So in Denmark, but this is true in many countries, there is plenty of evidence about that. What we observe is that places that were largely affected by incoming refugees respond with an increase in the number of votes for anti-immigration parties. What I really like of this study is that is looking at differences between rural and urban areas. So when we look at this decomposition effect, we see that there are positive effects in terms of voting for anti-immigration in rural areas, but in the most urban municipalities, so large municipality, refugees allocation has, if anything, an opposite effect. And so this coincides potentially with a sharp divide in attitudes towards refugees between urban and rural population, which has something to say about the interaction between natives and refugees. And so I think this particular aspect very interesting. So this average political effect somehow masks a high degree of heterogeneity according to the local context or the type of exposure. So it's crucial to investigate what are the mechanisms that induce some places to respond more or less to immigration. And so in the last piece of evidence I want to show, I would like to bring your attention to two couple of drivers, economic versus intergroup contact drivers. Next one. Yes, so this is the context of Italy, where joint with other co-authors, we investigate the contribution of different mechanisms. So this table is showing the effect of the increase in the vote share for anti-immigration parties in Italy in the national election of 2018, interacted by different mechanisms that has something to say about the economic prosperity of the equation. And what we see here is that economic drivers positively contribute to anti-immigration backlash. So essentially, richer area respond more and vote more for anti-immigration parties in that election. On the other side, instead, when we look at intergroup contact, these dimensions that has something to say about the ability of past immigrants to be integrated in the society. So we are looking at residential integration, naturalization rate, intermarriage rate, and local participation into local political municipality. We see that all these measures essentially induce negative effect in terms of vote share. So if anything, they have the ability to mitigate anti-immigration backlash. And these results, I think, are important and somehow aligns with the contact hypothesis, so with the importance of inclusion. So in the last slide, so essentially, there is, according to Alport and to a big literature, interactions with members of another group reduce negative stereotypes under some conditions. So if there is equality of status, common goal, interdependent work, so effective cooperation, and if authorities support intergroup contact. So I think that this is useful to ask if we can translate this theory and the evidence we have into policies. And potentially we can think about two channels. The first one is information updating, with the idea that individuals have misperceptions, so wrong representation, but facing updated knowledge about about the reality. Essentially, they can update their belief and lowers misperception with important consequences. On the other side, another channel is perspective taking. So the idea is that regardless of acquiring new information, so things that I already knew, now that I, when I face, important or meaningful interaction with the out group, this perception makes me think in a different way. So I'm not, acquiring new information, but I'm feeling the other group closer to myself. So I change my taste and preferences, and this affects also outcomes. So let me just conclude, say that there are perils and promises of diversity. It's fundamental to acknowledge diversity in many aspects. Many are tackled in the book. Here I'm focusing on the cultural dimension to overcome this anchoring down effect of diversity. The good, let's say the positive take home is that group boundaries are malleable and respond to information updating and perspective taking. So these probably are, policies or avenues for inclusion we can think about for the future.
Well, thank you, Julia. Very interesting results. Also, this malleability of groups is very interesting. Now, the floor to Andrea Brandolini.
So good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. Great pleasure to read Paul Collier's book, and delighted to be here to join this conversation. As Francesco said, the book is an extraordinarily informed tour de force on the histories of many places and countries in last decades. Some issues in the book are more familiar to me, like inequalities in the UK and the US, and relationship with the industrialization, or the link between income and opportunities inequalities. But of course, what I liked most in the book was the way in which Paul tells many stories, mostly unknown to me, that is enjoyable when you read a book, to point his overall picture. Let me pick just two very quickly. I didn't know anything about the similar, yet at the end of the day, opposite stories of Tanzania and Singapore. He spends a lot of time talking about these two countries, and that is very revealing. But also the little known anomaly of Somaliland. And I should confess that I didn't know that Somaliland exists. So I confess my ignorance publicly here. But let me also point to one specific point, and it is the account of the exploitation of the oil and gas in the North Sea, whose rights are almost equally shared between Norway and the UK. Paul has a very sharp description, very short, and he contrasts the tax revenues that the two countries extract from this right. $33 in Norway per barrel, and $11 in the UK. And that is indeed striking. But I would have liked that Paul had elaborated more on this point. Why? Because Norway created a special fund to administer the revenues and fixed that the benefit should be shared with future generations. Only a small proportion of the revenues, the tax revenues, can be used for current public expenditure, while the rest is managed by this fund that has become one of the largest, possibly the largest sovereign fund in the world. To my knowledge, nothing similar happened in the UK, but I confess that I didn't delve that into. So it is a very interesting point, from a conceptual point, very interesting to understand why two countries that have a very high level of development, very strong institutions, went these two very different routes. I think it has to do with social preferences, but I have no answer. So that is a provocation for Paul for the future. I know that he is writing a paper exactly on this issue, so I look forward to reading the paper, trying to find an answer. But let me turn to some more general comments quickly. And Paul, excuse me, I will be on the critical side just to help the discussion. So as it was said, the focus of the book is on places that once were prosperous and now are poor or have fallen behind. And that has a consequence of some kind of mostly economic external shock. And so the main question is, what can be done in these situations? So in my reading of the book, in a nutshell, there are three main arguments in the book. The first one, the orthodox answer provided by market fundamentalism, a la Friedman, so let markets do their job, has proved wrong. Paul uses the word dangerous nonsense. Hence, we need a different approach. Second, we need to go beyond economics. Yes, there has been it says subversive research in regional economics, but we needed to turn to evolutionary social psychology, to political science, and to moral philosophy. That is the point that Paul does. Third argument, the policy prescription, Francesco mentioned that, and also Giulia, based on this new approach and corroborated by several real-world experiences discussed in the paper, in the book, is that agency should rest with local people who are better placed to judge what might work in their context. Now, the orthodoxy of market fundamentalism is the evil in this book. And I fully understand what Paul has in mind, because myself, I experienced what he means when I was exposed to the article for IMF visits, periodic visits. Probably most of you don't know what these are, but IMF regularly visits countries to discuss their economic situation. And the worse the situation is, the toughest is the position taken by the IMF. And discussing issues of North-South divide and territorial problems, I remember that the economists from the IMF obsessively complained about the rigidity of the national wage contracts that fixed the same level, minimum wage level, and prevented wages in the South to go down enough to re-equilibrate things. And they asked continuously, and people from East that probably knows very well, they asked continuously for a territorial price index allowing to measure differences in the cost of living between the North and the South. So I understand what Paul means. But apart from the market fundamentalism as a theory, but the villain is definitely the British Treasury. Paul provides a rather brutal description throughout the book of the British Treasury. Actually, I asked him, but how was that taken by the British Treasury? I'm not concerned about the British Treasury, it's their matter, but let me point to one thing that I noticed in this criticism. There are two different aspects in the criticism by Paul. The Treasury is imbued of market fundamentalism, one. Second, the Treasury centralizes all decisions. Hence, we need to abandon both. My point is that these aspects are intertwined, but they are not the same. So we could have market fundamentalism with decentralization. And actually, I would argue that probably it is even more consistent market fundamentalism with decentralization. Or we could have some alternative economic approach maintaining centralization. And I'm probably alone in this room. Let me say that if I'm forced to choose, I would go for the second option. So I'm not a great fan of devolution for Italy. Let me expand a bit on this. Paolo, you stop me if I long. What concerns me is that while market fundamentalism has definitely been dominant in the last 4 decades or so, we did not lack alternative views in economics, which, if followed, could have brought about different outcomes. I quote just as an example, and partly from my personal experience, in the mid-90s, Amartya Sen visited the Bank of Italy. We conducted a joint project at the Bank of Italy to evaluate, to assess public policies using metrics alternative to income. So that was 10 years ahead of time because it was beyond GDP, while nobody used that word at the time. So Amartya Sen, for sure, and I think that Amartya Sen and the capability approach provided the most coherent conceptual framework alternative to the utilitarian framework. Let me mention Albert Hirschman. Albert Hirschman, the tunnel effect, I think, can help us a lot to explain the recent rise of populist and anti-establishment positions. Danny Roderick warned in 1997, he said, the most serious challenge for the world economy in the years ahead lies in making globalization compatible with domestic, social, and political stability, or to put it even more directly, in ensuring that international economic integration does not contribute to domestic social disintegration. That was 1997. So the warning was well before what happened afterwards. And Tony Atkinson, of course, was a big voice saying rising inequality is not inevitable. So these are few examples. The point is that while I'm totally sympathetic with your idea of crossing disciplinary borders, something that I've practiced myself a lot, economics is still much richer than market fundamentalism. And so this is something that does not show up in your book. So that is a point. Let me follow this point again. We'll have
The last one.
yes. No, two points. So the critical point is that when you advise politicians, you can, and you know very well, you cannot simply say, oh, the world is too complex. The spiral staircase that you use, the metaphor, is fascinating, but it is of little use in practice. You cannot say to politicians that he needs or she needs self-sacrificing leadership, devolving agency, and communicating a hopeful yet credible strategy. It doesn't work in practice. So I think that what we need to do is to work on the tools that economists use. I look at Pietro, but the ESG models are the workhorse for macroeconomists. Now, we can do a lot working on the ESG models. The HANC, the heterogeneous agents mechanism models, are certainly one important step forward. Another one is to change the way we measure social implications, looking at the different formulation of the social welfare function. This is the last point. So I don't say anything about this devolution, decentralization, because everything was already said. But there is a final point that I think is very important. Left behind refers to the outcome of a shock hitting a place. What we would need to discuss is that many shocks are not exogenous, but happen because some economic or political actors went in a certain direction. So this implies a change of perspective, not acting ex post to remedy the negative consequences of these shocks, but to act ex ante to prevent or to put in place policies mitigating the negative effect of the shocks. This consideration links to what I said before about economists, people like Atkinson and Roderick. And let me finish by quoting why I think this point is absolutely crucial for us, because of the discussion that we are having about technological developments and artificial intelligence. And let me quote Tony Atkinson first. In his last book, he wrote, the first proposals to fight inequalities was the direction of technology, the direction of technological change should be an explicit concern of policymakers, encouraging innovation in a form that increases the employability of workers and emphasizes the human dimension of service provision. The last quote, and I finish, is from the last book by Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, Power and Progress, and where they say 1,000 years of history and contemporary evidence make one thing clear: progress depends on the choices we make about technology. So that means that we must think as societies to ways to guide in some ways this process. And sorry to have been too long. Thanks.
President Amato, the word is just one thing for the order. You think we exactly. Exactly. I wanted to understand with you. You want to speak, and then we leave the floor for a couple of questions, and then the author concludes. Yes, but before or after you speak? If there is time left, I speak.
Forse lo puoi prendere così, Pietro. Sì.
Question is the following. So there are 2 points in the book. No, one is that you don't believe in the idea that people are so much self-interested. So we have 3. We interpret that fact that we like to be more And you stress this very much. So, in sense, this it is a so
GDP. That in home first, the this approach, I'm not sure because, for example, to the NRR, the Italian PNRR, that's basically an approach. So, in my impression, European Commission are thinking of approach in terms of policy implementation, in terms of growth for regional territories.
The way in which you inclusive institution, because very institution can be in, you take a very small boundary that is individual, so the boundary is independent of the inclusiveness. And and some way of cooperating. One, and you have a lot of nice. I have a specific question about you, pattern, okay, Putman, you know, and Putman, you know, about the comuni having this form of bottom-up type of identity. And then you South the same thing. But then you explain, you know, you say this is still something that is visible in north-south side. To the question in a very sharp. Then one can add, reading your book, that was not having this identity, but also not having a barrier like, you know, a leader like in Tanzania, because then you can argue for the South, given that it was a centralized system, should have had a leader, and he never had the leader. There's somehow the feeling of shared identity. So some French could be effective.
I am a given that no okay global thing process evidence. The shall produce the site um,
Right, thank you very much. So I think let me start with what is a state? Oh yes, there was a question, the first question. Yes, that's right. It was what is a state? Okay, so just let me, given that, basically, given that Premier Maloney has no strategy, what now? Was the essence of it. Yeah. So I think there are two answers to that. One is that you do need the alternative is a bottom-up social movement. And I give the example of the Basque region, where even lacking good political leadership, this very powerful bottom-up social movement started by a Jesuit priest, but then escalated and ended up with Mondragon, which is huge, now a huge organization, that bottom-up approach gradually changed the culture of the Basque region. Remember, the Basque region, those of you who've not read the book, the Basque region started in the 1970s as far more damaged than anything in southern Italy. It was an industrial basket case, and it had two violent wars, one a violent secessionist movement of the Basques trying to get out of the whole federation with Spain, which should have been, just a constitutional no-no. Here I agree with President Amato that whatever it is vital to stop any hint of secessionist movements being a permissible option. So the Basque region started violent and desperately poor, and that was in as late as the 1970s. By the 1920s, sorry, by the 2020s, it was the richest region in Spain. And it was entirely transformed by this bottom-up social movement, which had built itself so that it would clone itself. It would focus on skills, on training, vocational training, plus a culture of cooperation. And it gradually changed the habits of the place. The most dramatic moment was when they persuaded the Guggenheim to rebase in the Basque region, which was seemingly a vanishingly unlikely thing, but very quickly the region was able to cooperate, agree there could only be one place. It would have to be the main city. They all had to agree with that. They then said, we all have to contribute to the whole. This is contributive justice in action, but I admit at the scale of a unit that is smaller. And so everybody contributed very fast. They knew they hadn't got long. And so within a month, the whole had contributed 100 million euro. So this is not small money. They'd contributed 100 million euro to build the thing in the one city. And then they went to the Guggenheim and said, here is 100 million euro. We will give you the agency of choice. You choose whatever architect you want, and we will pay for it. There's the 100 million. Nobody else did that. And so it went to, so Guggenheim agreed. And that was indeed transformational. I first knew about it when I was at the World Bank. It suddenly became essential for the then president of the World Bank, Wolfenson, to make a state visit to Madrid, and then take a further state visit up to the Basque region. So this was tourism on a grand scale. Anyway, so that was a bottom-up strategy. I'll come back to the question of what else can you do if you've got a bad government, because the other thing is just replace the government. You've got to have a credible strategy that says this is a better strategy than what Maloney has got. And the better strategy has to be something that wins more votes. So it has to be crafted in such a way that it's in most people's interest to vote for this policy. Yeah. And that credible strategy has the advantage over a false policy of being genuinely credible. The crafty politician who hasn't got a credible strategy will disguise that by it'll sound credible to poor people for 2 minutes. And so you've got to be a skilled communicator to anticipate the likely moves of a charlatan, which is the name I'll use for politicians who offer hope but not credibly. There are plenty of charlatans about. You have to anticipate the likely moves of the charlatan and preempt that. And in the book, I give some examples of how charlatans were preempted by Sir Seretse Khama, the first president of Botswana, as it happened. He was able to preempt a populist strategy by anticipating it. Let me turn to Professor Drago, first of all, thank you very much for your preface. It was a beautiful preface. Your summary, the emphasis upon the problem with top-down and the irredeemable problem with top-down is that it removes agency from people. And removing agency is a major problem. I'd very much liked, if I had to jump ahead to your data intervention, and this is jumping ahead, I realize, but your question was, as a national data gathering agency, couldn't you do more to involve ordinary people in contributing to the data about them? And that is completely right. In I think a much earlier version of Left Behind, and I rewrote Left Behind 30 times in order for it to be readable to a large audience. Because I rewrote it 30 times, I can't honestly remember what was in the 29th version or the 27th version or the 15th version, but not in the 30th. So this may be in the final version, but I doubt it. So there's an important concept of that every interaction between a public official and a citizen, every interaction between a public official and a citizen is a teachable moment. The citizen is going to learn something about that interaction. And in some countries, what they learn is a teachable moment that teaches them this government doesn't care about me. And in other situations, that teachable moment treats the person with sufficient respect and dignity that they feel part of the place. And I give examples from all over the world, some very unlikely places where the teachable moments were entirely positive. misnamed Democratic Republic of the Congo was actually doing some local interventions to try and raise taxes, which turned out to be a positive teachable moment. People interpreted the attempt to call on them and say, you know, please will you pay your taxes, as showing that the government was at least trying to do something. So collecting data is a splendid example of a teachable moment. There are massive variations to leap ahead on European policy, European social cohesion policy. There are massive differences within Europe in attitudes towards data on people, data on individuals. The most extreme hostility to data is in Germany, where they are fighting fear of the Stasi. And I want to tell Germans, actually, the German state now is not a small variant on the Stasi. The German state now is nothing like the Stasi. And so your obsession with secrecy is totally misplaced. You know, I hope I contributed my little bit. It's just come out in German yesterday, Left Behind. So I hope I've contributed my little bit towards nudging the Germans into a more realistic assessment of the role of the state. Britain is also is closer to Germany than I would like. We have no national identity card. If you want to establish your identity, the only way you can do it is get a passport. Well, of course, half the population never goes internationally traveling. Yeah. And so they don't need a passport. And of course, a passport is costly to buy. Very costly, actually, of the order of £1,800. So most people cannot establish their identity. And periodically, governments have tried to introduce identity cards, and there is always a massive campaign against them. And this is mad. This is simply mad. This is fear of the state and the desire for secrecy. When I walk into my local supermarket in Oxford, the manager of that supermarket has already identified me by the contour of my right ear. I can be recognized by my earlobes by the shop cameras at the entrance to the shop. My purchasing data has all been instantly constructed, my preferences, by reading my what I watch on YouTube, what I put on Facebook. I take the precaution of not doing any of the above, so they're a bit at a loss with me. But most people, that supermarket manager knows everything about them within the first minute they're in that shop. The only agency that doesn't know anything about them is the British government, which doesn't know their names or where they live. So Britain is almost as bad as Germany, not quite. Yeah. So that, just to go back to your point, yes, these teachable moments are enormously important, and data gathering, which is so essential. This is something where the European Commission could actually just say to the Germans and the British, stop being silly. You've got to provide a free form of identity to all your citizens in that period. That would be a good piece of regulation. Harmonize on that. You have 3 minutes because your I'm sorry. Yeah. the inclusion point. So thank you very much, Julia. I said two things. One is, as I recall, it's a little while since I read the paper, and I think I cite the paper in the book, but it's a little while since I read it, that the left behind are not more racist than the successful. If the successful were faced the same pressures as the left behind, they just behave very much like the left behind. So the attempt to typecast left behind people as racist is I think grossly unfair. But I do want to turn to the example of riots in Britain, which you're bound to have noticed, and here's where I think some very foolish public policies created an inevitable narrative of hostility to irregular immigrants. And so today's Financial Times, if you take a look at it, you will see that the cost to Britain, to the British government, per asylum seeker is £41,000 per year. So every asylum seeker we get is costing the British government £41,000. Why? Because we put them up in hotels. Where do we put them? Which hotels do we put them in? Well, in order to save money, it's 41,000, not 61,000. We don't put them in hotels in London. We put them in hotels in the poorest parts of the country. And so the people of Doncaster or Rotherham, people who rioted, these are the poorest parts of the country. These were the parts where left behind and the whole business of leveling up, of trying to help the poorest regions was notionally pitched. We were spending £100 million a year nationally on leveling up. 100 million. We're spending over 6 billion a year on housing asylum seekers in hotels, specially chosen to be the places where the leveling up agenda never happened. And so, is it surprising that the people in Rotherham and Doncaster, who have never, the poorest people in that community, who've never set foot in the good hotel in their town, but discover that there are asylum seekers housed there, in their minds in luxury, because it's the top hotel in the town, £41,000 per year per asylum seeker, and how much was spent on them? About £5 each. And so it's that contrast is bound to exacerbate the things. So it was a policy which was utterly foolish, given the context, given the way that it was designed to save money, but not to put people in places where they would be accepted, to put people in places where people were being so ignored that it was bound to exacerbate ethnic tensions. Let me see. Yeah, last call. So I very much liked your remarks on the sort of bounded notion of identity and the fact that that we build shared identity, but in a bounded range. And what does that imply? Does it mean that we have to have a trade-off between social welfare and an inclusive state? I think not. I think the answer is it means that the pace at which we assimilate new migrants or new anything has to be at a pace that is acceptable to the society, and that will vary between societies. So we can't have a one-size-fits-all there, but it needs to be at a pace which is acceptable to the society, and that then absorbs people, integrates people sufficiently so that they are gradually acquire enough of the local culture to feel part of the society. I give in the book the example of how Muslims in Singapore were integrated into the whole brilliantly by Lee Kuan Yew, a very carefully designed strategy, so that Muslims in Singapore became fully part of the contributing to the whole. So that's one example. There are several examples in the book of that, but I think giving people, everybody, a voice, an equal voice in that debate over what should be the pace that is acceptable. This can't be chosen by the elite just on the basis of elite preferences. That is just as much an abuse as any other tiny minority hijacking political power. So the temptation of the elite to say, my moral values are superior to your moral values, that I think has to be resisted. Saying, the elite saying, I know better than you, and therefore I should take the decisions on you, that may sometimes be justified, right? It's at least, but it does depend upon the track record of the government. A track record of a government which has taken wise decisions, like the government of Denmark, can say, we know best. And Mette Frederiksen demonstrated that by giving moral instructions over how to avoid COVID and saying, you know, we do know about this more than you. So the instruction is protect your neighbor. And Danes were sufficiently confident in the capacities of the government, which had earned the right to be trusted, that they agreed with her. The British government, having messed up on not just on oil, but almost everything else that it cares to touch, has less natural authority to claim extreme competence. And so it shouldn't push its luck. You know, it needs to earn the right to be trusted. It shouldn't insist that it knows best. It has to demonstrate that it knows best. On all your points, I do agree with you, right? That it's true that I don't acknowledge the many other currents, which of course are correct. So on all that, mea culpa.
On this confession, we have to close because the signs from behind are very explicit. Thank you very much, Professor Collier. Thank you. And to the next meeting. Thank you. Okay.